The air is thick with smoke. Your lungs burn with every gasp. The proud walls that once guarded your city have collapsed into heaps of rubble. Beyond the ruins, the horizon is alive with horsemen, thousands of them. Banners snapping in the wind, hooves shaking the earth like thunder. You thought the siege would end in death. You thought you would be spared suffering. But you were wrong. With the Mongols, a quick death was not always the punishment. Often, it was the mercy. What came for the captured was not the end, but the beginning. An ordeal designed to break not just bodies, but entire civilizations. The rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century was not only a military conquest, it was psychological domination. Villages surrendered before the first arrow was loosed. Cities collapsed without a single wall being scaled. Why? Because word spread faster than horses. Rumors, stories, and eyewitnesses painted a picture so horrifying that resistance felt pointless. Survivors carried nightmares with them, tales of executions, of mutilations, of entire populations erased. These were not exaggerations. They were deliberate acts of reputation building. Fear itself was the Mongols' sharpest weapon. For the Mongols, punishment was not random cruelty, it was strategy. Every execution was a performance, every act of violence carefully staged for maximum effect. They knew the mind was easier to conquer than the fortress wall. A single mutilated survivor could terrify a city more than 1,000 arrows. Defiance was not crushed in silence, it was crushed in spectacle. And if you fell into their hands alive, you were not just a prisoner, you were a tool in their theater of fear. Imagine being captured and forced to march at the front of their army, chained to your neighbors, driven straight towards the walls of another city. The defenders look down, and their hearts sink. They see their kin, their brothers, their wives, being pushed forward as human shields. Do they fire upon their own? Do they surrender? Either choice fractures the spirit of resistance. This was the genius of Mongol cruelty. Terror was not wasted. It was recycled, redirected, amplified. The executions themselves were chosen with precision. Nobles, for example, were too valuable to be slaughtered like commoners. Mongol law forbade the spilling of royal blood, and so they died differently, strangled with bowstrings, their faces turning blue, their eyes bulging in silence. Others were trampled beneath horses, their bones snapping one by one, each scream and echo carved into the minds of those watching. To the Mongols, the manner of death mattered. It sent a message. Resistance does not just end you, it unmakes you. Some punishments defied imagination. Prisoners were sewn alive into raw animal hides, left beneath the blazing sun. As the hide dried, it shrank, crushing flesh and bone, suffocating the victim inside a coffin of leather. Others were buried up to their necks, their heads left exposed to sun, wind, and insects. For days they remained alive, groaning, eyes swelling, lips cracked, until death finally claimed them. Along roads, these heads became grotesque milestones, silent warnings to travelers of what awaited the defiant. But the Mongols were not wasteful. Not everyone was killed. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, scribes were spared. They were taken far across the empire, forced to work for the very war machine that destroyed their homes. Their survival was not freedom, it was enslavement. Their talent became shackles, binding them to an empire that thrived on stolen genius. In the Mongols' eyes, every prisoner had a use, a tool, a laborer, or a lesson. Women and children, too, were often spared, but not out of mercy. They were absorbed, assimilated, their identity stripped away. A daughter might be taken into a Mongol household, her language, her faith, her culture erased until she was no longer who she had been. Children grew up under Mongol rule, carrying new loyalties, new bloodlines. Conquest was not just about land, it was about lineage. The future itself was rewritten with every child born of conquest. Survival became a different kind of execution, the death of identity. For commanders, humiliation was the final act. A captured general might be paraded before his own soldiers, forced to kneel, stripped of dignity, made to beg for mercy that would never come. Then, his execution was staged before the eyes of his followers. His death was not his alone. It was the shattering of morale, the severing of loyalty. The Mongols knew, kill a man and you end his life. Kill him publicly, and you break the will of those who once believed in him. Every punishment carried a message. Death by trampling reminded nobles that their rank could not save them. Strangulation by bowstring showed that even the laws of blood could be turned into weapons. Being sewn into hides or buried alive demonstrated that resistance would not just end in death, it would end in suffering beyond imagination. And when survivors were released, mutilated, scarred, branded, they became walking billboards of Mongol terror, living proof that surrender was the only rational choice. Even death was weaponized. Corpses could be mutilated to deny enemies peace in the afterlife. Plague-infected bodies were hurled over city walls, spreading disease as silently as arrows. The Mongols turned flesh into fear, turning the battlefield into a message board. Conquest was not simply won with steel, it was won with memory. Memories so vivid that they outlived the victims themselves. But cruelty alone did not build the largest contiguous empire in the history. It was the combination of ruthlessness and pragmatism. The Mongols knew when to destroy and when to preserve. Entire populations could be massacred to set an example, while others were relocated, their labor harnessed for Mongol ambition. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and countless others saw their artisans carried off, their knowledge transplanted, their culture bent to Mongol will. Survival was not life. Survival was enslavement. The result was a system of fear so efficient that many cities surrendered before a single Mongol arrow flew. Word of Nishapur's destruction spread like wildfire. In 1221, after the death of a Mongol commander, the city was annihilated. Tens of thousands were killed, and survivors were scattered. Those who lived carried the horror with them, telling others what awaited if resistance continued. Years later, in 1237, Ryazan in Russia faced a similar fate. Burned to the ground, its people enslaved or marched into exile. The message was clear: resist, and you would not just lose, you would vanish. This was the genius of the Mongol strategy. Their armies didn't have to fight every battle. They let reputation do the work. Terror was cheaper than arrows, faster than sieges, more devastating than fire. Once a city believed resistance was hopeless, its gates opened on their own. The Mongols turned cruelty into policy, and policy into empire. Fear was their most reliable ally, and they wielded it with surgical precision. But imagine yourself, a prisoner standing in the dust, bound and waiting. You've watched others trampled, strangled, sewn into hides. You've seen nobles humiliated, artisans dragged away, women taken, children stolen. You wait, knowing that your fate is not yours to choose. Will you be killed today? Or will you be kept alive to build, to dig, to suffer, to watch others die until your turn comes? The Mongols did not give certainty, they gave dread. And sometimes dread itself was the cruelest punishment of all. Even when they spared lives, the Mongols ensured those lives carried scars. Mutilation was common. Survivors might be released with ears or noses cut off, branded, marked forever. They were not simply let go, they were sent back as warnings, physical messages carved into flesh. Every scar told a story. Every missing limb whispered, "This is what happens when you resist." And those stories spread faster than armies, infecting minds with fear before the Mongols ever arrived. Cities learned quickly. Some surrendered without resistance, choosing humiliation over annihilation. But surrender carried its own cost. Tribute was demanded: grain, livestock, gold, and sometimes children to serve as hostages. Submission bought survival, but survival meant subjugation. The Mongols did not simply conquer land, they conquered choice itself. Whether you fought or surrendered, your fate lay in their hands. They decided who lived, who died, who was spared, who was erased. And in every decision, terror lingered. Consider this. The Mongols were masters of siege warfare, but often they didn't need to fight. They would display captured prisoners outside the walls, mutilated, begging, or already dead. They would send messages written not in ink, but in screams. Defenders looking down saw not soldiers, but the inevitable future. And when the gates finally opened,